let's start with introductions. I'll start with Kevin Tyler, my good friend from Vancouver. Kevin is the president of ALTIS. Kevin, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Jimson. Welcome to everybody in Australia and around the world. I'm at my home here in Atlanta. It's now 4 a.m. in the morning, but obviously very happy to be up. And when Mike, Jimson, and I were talking about this, I figured it was a lot easier for me to get up at 4 a.m. than to have a whole country get up in the middle of the night. And I figured that everyone down under was probably deserving of a dedicated presentation on your own time zone. So welcome and thanks for having us. Yeah, as Jim said, I'm the president at ALTIS. I've been coaching the 400 meters now for about 25 years, including the reigning Canadian record holder in the men's 400 and the men's 400 meter hurdles. And throughout my career, I've had 3 men ranked in the top 3 in the world, number 1, number 2, and number 3 in Fred Curley, Tyler Christopher, and Paul Dedewell. And interesting, right now in Atlanta, I'm actually working with an all-female group. So that's been an interesting change this year.
Thanks, Kevin. And then another friend I want to introduce is Mike Hurst. So Mike and I, we met actually on the Charlie Francis Forum about 22 years ago. Mike, welcome. Thanks for setting this up and suggesting this call.
Thanks, Jimson, and thanks, Kevin. Mike, I guess my background in the 400 is not at the level of Kevin's, and he's worked with some superstars. And I had my first attempt at coaching the 400 was really only very early, or well, 85. Started working with Marie Holland and got her to rank in the top 8 in the world. And then we had a terrible disaster at the Commonwealth Games in Edinburgh in 86. And I tore up my program, completely rethought it, came up with something that made, to me, a lot more sense. I called it my concurrent design, training design, program design. And Darren Clark came into the group with Marie. Both of them reached the Olympic final for the 400 in Seoul in 88. Both of them set national records, state and national records. Marie ran 50.24 in her semi. Darren ran 44.38 in his semi. And those times are reasonably respectable today, but you know, it's 30 odd years ago now. So the event has moved on, and you could argue it's more of a sprint than it ever was. But I'm really happy to be here, always happy to talk 400, even though I was absolutely hopeless at it myself.
Great, thanks, Mike. So I think it's pretty clear that we got a huge, diverse level of coaching and athletes from all different levels. So we got like 30 questions here. So let's start one by one. We'll go through them all. If you want to ask a question, please put it in the chat window below. So question number 1, let's talk about considerations for the youth development coaches versus coaches at the senior level and the elite level. Let's talk to Kevin first. So what would you think are some consideration in those 2 different groups, as well as differences between the men and women athletes?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why we put this question here was because I wanted to just, kind of lay some groundwork here. I think it's, I did a lot of work with Derek Evely, who people may know was actually the high performance director at Loughborough University when we were there prior to the 2012 Olympics. And I think he always had said something very insightful, which was when you're a youth coach, it's really important to know where the athlete needs to be at the senior level and at the elite level, especially if you have aspirations for them to be competing at that level. And I always tried to keep that in mind. So regardless of where you are on the athlete development continuum, it's important to have an understanding of what the primary necessities and biomotor abilities are at a high performance level if you have aspirations for your athletes being at that level. And so we can get into some questions later about, how do young people, or how should young people best prepare themselves for this event. And I think Derek is a great example of somebody who did an incredible job with 3 very young athletes who went on to win medals at world championships level or break national records through a well-organized plan that had its eye on, what the high performance attributes that were required for them, and laying out like literally laying out a 10-year plan for those athletes, and then following it and moving them on to senior coaches when they were around 19 or 20 years of age. So that was the only kind of point I wanted to make around that. And maybe Mike has something to add there.
I would just say that I would always try to develop the qualities of speed, and that means technical efficiencies, and just all the properties that go into making someone quick. I wouldn't be training them long distance. Endurance can come, speed, but it can also blunt speed at an early age, and kids start to move up in distances and maybe they didn't need to. So I would always focus on speed at the early age, and then you can always layer on cycles of endurance as they get older, and they can handle it.
Yeah, and I know for myself, so I guess I'm a former athlete who turned masters and now do masters coaching as well. And I think at the masters level, it's fair to say that it's all about the attrition, getting athletes healthy and ready, because once you're injured, you're no good at the track. So that's my take on the masters level. And the question from the chat room is, someone asked, Wileen Rain asked, how do you coach the 400 to younger athletes under 10 who already have the fatigue associated with the 400? Anybody, Mike or Kevin?
I'll throw something up there. I would not coach those kids for the 400 at that age. I really wouldn't. I'd work on, as I said, the short sprints. I'd work on the 100 and the 200. And when they can handle those, take it out to the 300. And at some stage, when they're a bit older, maybe 14 or 15, maybe, if they want to take on the challenge, well, all right, let them race a 400, because it can be a very cruel event if you're not conditioned for it. I wouldn't be coaching kiddies to run the 4. Most of them, when I see little kids running a 4, it's like they're running a marathon, and it's the technique involved at those sorts of speeds is you don't want that in your body. You don't. That's just my personal opinion. Shoot me down. But I wouldn't be doing it.
Well, I think anyone under 15 should do more than one sport. I know growing up as a kid, I played baseball and I ran track, and those are my 2 sports growing up. And baseball, as we know, is a speed and power event, especially speed, because I love stealing bases. And that was my thing. And I guess, Kevin, you don't really coach super young athletes anymore. Any insight on coaching that level?
Yeah, I think, like, to your point, just I think 10's a little bit of a stretch. Okay, I mean, I've competed since I was 7 years old, and I definitely competed in the 400 as a young athlete. And I think there's a difference between training and specializing in an event and competing in an event. And if an event's fun and the athlete has some attributes that allow them to do it with some quality, and it doesn't look like they're deteriorating, then running the odd race is not going to be detrimental to them. But to your point, they should be involved in, multilateral development. And, I definitely would not make it a focus, because there's a danger here. And I think when young athletes, and I'm talking about post-puberty athletes, so we're talking about as we start to get in, 15, 16, 17 years old, and they start to get into the event, we still have a wide range of developmental abilities. And if you have an athlete focusing on the 400, we have to be very careful that they're not just being successful because of their early maturation. Because when we started this particular point or this particular question, what I was saying was it's important to understand what the primary attributes are for a successful athlete to perform at an elite level. And in the men's 4 and the women's 400 meters, speed reserve is a very important point. So your ability to hit a very high velocity, high running velocity, AKA Fred Curley now, silver medal in the 100 meters of the Olympics, and has also run 43.6, right? So, and to be able to develop some speed reserves, so having a high level of speed endurance. Now, if my warning to young coaches of young 400 meter runners would be, is that it's very easy. If you look at, I don't want to get too complicated here, but if you look at the velocity trace of a 400, so if you look at the how fast they're running over the course of the distance, most young people have a lot of room to improve by simply improving their endurance. If we focus on that endurance and we focus to a level of performance at an early age to achieve a level of performance, there's a risk that we're not developing the attributes that we need to have them develop as a senior athlete. Namely, they're not working on acceleration qualities, biomotor abilities that are going to make them explosive, the movement patterns that are required in the weight room to learn the techniques to do to lifts properly. Some basic jumping mechanics, so we know how to amortize and we know how to express force. So these are all things that, you want to have an explosive athlete. And so often what we'll see is athletes that'll be really successful because of early maturation. We'll see a focus on, the kind of more specific endurance or the endurance aspects of the event. And then because the athlete has success in the first year, the program will double down on those attributes. And eventually after 2 or 3 years, when the other kids that are faster and more explosive have caught up from a growth perspective, they'll shoot past, the 15-year-old boy that's running 49 seconds, who is basically going to plateau because, they can't break 11:50 in the 100 meters.
That's good. So this leads me to the next question, which is, so how do you consider the 400 meter event? Is it a sprint or endurance? What are the primary demands of the event, including the aerobic contribution to 400 meters? So Mike, I'll ask you, sprint versus endurance, what's the 400 meters?
It's kind of specific endurance, the capacity to sort of sail along with great relaxation at a threshold that you can handle, that won't generate too much what we still refer to it as lactic acid and force you to shut down. I think speed reserve is almost everything in the 400 these days, and it probably always has been. But you just have to look at some of the splits that were generated at the Rio Olympics in the men's 400 to see where the event has moved. I think a lot of the aerobic component in a 400 is where you train the threshold between anaerobic and aerobic, and you can play around with that and keep pushing the edge of the envelope and extending the range over which you can endure your best speed. But it's a sprint. It's not a middle distance event at all.
Yeah.
So I think there's enough aerobic component just in the recovery times between reps and sets that you probably don't even need to go for long runs. I know it's very popular, and that's a lot of people still do it, but horses for courses. Some people are going to be very well suited by that kind of work, and maybe they're the 800 meter type coming down to the 4. But I wouldn't be chasing aerobics, not at the expense of speed sessions. I think you get enough aerobic work just in the recovery from short speed and 1s, 2s, 150s, 300s, and maybe with short recoveries. Or I think it's very much anaerobic. I know that there's been reports that 50% or 45% of the 400 is aerobic. I respectfully, that's not my finding at all.
Well, okay, I'll chime in here and I'll get Kevin's thoughts after. So for me, I like looking at science. And science says speed endurance 1 is 7 to 15 seconds. Speed endurance 2 is 15 to 40. And after 40 seconds, it's special endurance. So if you're running like Michael Johnson or Wade Van Niekerk, and you're running 43, well, it's only 3 seconds of that goes beyond 40 seconds. So for them, anybody running 44, their event, 100%, I think it's speed. And like Mike said, a bit of threshold, relaxed running. But when you get to my level now, and I'm turning 60 pretty soon, I'll be happy to run 60 seconds for 400 meters at age 60. Well, that last 20 seconds is in a different zone. So I'm going to train for this event differently than I did when I was, running with Kevin. So I'm definitely more of what's your time in the 400 and base it on science. And that's, but I still think speed is number one, which is the sprint component. Kevin, you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, we could talk for a long time on this. This is a very big question. So I think, first of all, if anyone's seen Coach Paff speak, if anyone's watched any of our videos, that it's important to understand that all of these energy systems exist and are operating in parallel. And so it's only a difference between emphases based on the level of intensity. So that's the first thing. When you look at the event now and you see what's happening at the elite level, and again, I don't want to make this call purely about elite athletes, but I think, like I started this conversation with saying, is that it's really important to understand what elite athletes are able to do if you're working with young people. Pretty much now, the top 3 or 4 men in the world are largely breaking 10 seconds in the 100 meters. Okay. If you look at Michael Norman, if you look at Fred Curley, Wade Van Niekerk, when he was at his prime, they're all sub 10 runners. Ry Benjamin in the hurdles is very close to breaking 10 seconds. I'm not sure if he's quite broken. I think he's right on the precipice there at 10:0. Okay. And even if they're not able to run 10 seconds, and typically that's because we can get into this a little bit later if we're talking about biomechanics and the difference between how athletes produce force, whether they're more elastic, whether they're pullers, or whether they're more kind of muscular driven in terms of more concentric activity, and they're applying, they generate they generate force by pushing. That if you have a lot of 400 meter runners are puller type athletes, and the reason they're not running 10 flat is simply because their first 20 to 30 meters are not fantastic. Okay. But when you get them on the fly, they're absolutely capable of hitting those types of velocities that top sprinters hit in the 100 meters. So, that's incredibly important. There's a really good piece. It's an old piece now by PJ Vizel that talks about speed reserve and the speed reserve, basically after he crunched all the data, determining that speed reserve is the single biggest factor determining success in elite 400 meter running now. And if you're not familiar with that concept, I mean, essentially what it means is your ability to, the difference between what your race pace would be at 200 meters, the opening 200 meters, versus what your personal best performance was in the 200 meters. And typically now you're seeing, with the men, the capability of running anywhere from 19.6 to, I would say you have to pretty much be around 20.2 to be world class, but some guys are getting away with it at 20.4. Again, on the women's side, I'm coaching a young woman right now that's run 49.7. She's run 22.7 indoors. Okay. And she's run 34.9 for 300 meters in practice from a standing start. So those are the types of performances that are required to run at that level. So, I think that's the key takeaway there. And then it's an understanding of how each specific athlete, what their strengths are and what their attributes are. And it's easy to start talking about energy systems here because a lot of the literature is written from an energy system perspective, and it's important to have an awareness of this. But as I said, because all these systems are working in parallel, it's important to have a fluid understanding of these concepts. And I would encourage anyone, I know there's a question in here about 400, 800 meter training, because that's not a double that we typically see now. You saw that in the 70s, Juan Torino, able to pull off the 4 double at the 76 Olympics. Typically now, although the 800 meter runners are becoming a lot stronger, and that in and of itself is becoming more of a sprint, they don't have the attributes that allow them to compete at a 400 meter level. But Gareth Sanford, and I know he spent some time down under, probably New Zealand, or has written a couple of really good pieces on 800-meter training and how that's evolving. And I would encourage anyone that's listening that has an interest in that to read that article, or to source his name, because what he's saying is that it's, and this is particularly important in the 800 because of the tactical nature of the event, is that we need to start to look at specific case scenarios and understand our particular athlete, the demands of the event, what their strengths are, and not, I wouldn't say what their weaknesses are, but where the windows of opportunity are. Okay, there's a difference between windows of opportunity and weakness. And when we look at a kind of a fluid manner like that, I think we're in a better position to kind of construct programs. Because I think one of the most frustrating things about talking to experienced high performance coaches is you're going to always get this answer is it depends, because there is so much variation between the attributes that drive any of these individual elite athletes that now there are some common macro factors as we discussed, such as speed, but there's massive variation. There's a massive variation in what they respond to in training. And I'll give you, I need to dominate the conversation here. I'll give you a good example. I've had athletes that have appeared to be endurance-based type 400-meter runners that have been on classic kind of traditional high volume, middle intensity 400-meter training programs that maybe because they had, been saturated with that type of work and stereotyped with that type of work, that have responded really well to a season of a short to long program that is very much biased in, a speed and acceleration development. Similarly, I've had athletes that have looked like they would be primary candidates for a qualitative speed-based approach who are not able to get enough volume in on that program because their nervous system can't handle the intensity of a high intensity program that is largely speed dominant. And so, when you have to start to spread out, the speed qualities, they become so thin in order to get, enough volume in, you have to start to do other types of work with them or their nervous system. And I had one athlete who had run 44.8, who had made the final at the World Championships. And I mean, within 6 months, I basically ruined him. And, and put my hand up, like, I mean, this is how you learn. And you have to always be assessing, what you're doing, your athlete's responses, and how you can approach it differently. Because he started out fantastic. He started out gangbusters and thought, this kid's going to go under 44.5 this year. And within about 8 weeks, his nervous system was shot from the intensity of the work.
No, good point. And I know we can talk about training long to short to long. We'll carry that a bit later in the call, but I want to keep that thought about keeping people healthy and nervous systems. We'll save that for later. So let's just move on. Another question here. So I know in September, October, my Twitter feed was loaded with people, friends and coaches who joined a new school, new clubs. So the question is, how do you onboard a new athlete? So whether it's you joining a new group, like, new school, or you're already coaching and you have a new person joining your group. Mike, I'll start with you first, because Mike Hurst, for those who don't know, has a Facebook page and a club called Fast Track 400. I think most of you on this call are on that group, but you can see Mike's evolution as a coach, as a person, bringing in new athletes. They come and go, they run well, they get injured. So it's a great little personal diary of the history of his club. So Mike, how do you onboard new athletes? What are your assessment process when you join, when you have someone join your club?
This is, excuse me, it's just me, but I want to find out what their ambitions are like and what level of commitment could they initially begin with, in terms of, are you going to turn up once a month? Because if that's what you're going to do, you probably could go somewhere else. But if you're willing to turn up at least twice a week, well, then maybe let's get started. And what I would do is I would watch them from left side, right side, front on, from behind. I would video them. And often, if there's a problem, I would use those videos as a diagnostic and probably annoy the hell out of Dan Paff, who's mentor to about 8 million coaches, of whom I'm one, and say, what do you see? If you get some time, could you just run your eye over this? And a lot of the time, to be honest, I would miss some pretty important stuff that required therapy, or I would see something that was just odd. I would know that it required therapy, but maybe some guidance from Dan, because I think he knows more than most physiotherapists, to be honest. And a lot of our physio is sometimes, or a chiropractor as well, occasionally guided by Dan. And Dan, as you probably know, works for ALTIS and does an absolutely awesome job. He's an awesome, awesome man. So I would have a look at how they move and try to understand the construct, and have a look at the shape that they make when they run. Have a look at what they're doing on the ground and how they get off the floor. And some people, you need to work with them for a few months before it becomes apparent. One young lady turned up, she was a skipping rope girl, a very good one, 4th in the world rope skipping championships, Rebecca Bennett. And she turned up as a school kid who couldn't make her school 400-metre team as a 17-year-old, coming into her final year at high school. And she wanted to, so someone directed her to me. She came down, she ran for me, she ran about 10 metres, and I said, okay, thanks for coming, I'll be in touch. And she was, I think, quite hurt and thought that I dumped her and rejected her. But I hadn't, because after 10 metres, honestly, 10, maybe 20 metres, maybe one run, maybe two, I could see that she had everything that she needed to be a fabulous 400-metre runner. And within a year, she was on the podium at the National Junior Championships for the women's 400. And 3 or 4 years later, she was anchoring the Australian Open team at the most recent World Championships in Doha in 2019. Similarly with Ian Halpin, who came to me. I'd seen him, I'd noticed him, and I said, he rang me, cold called me. He didn't even know I knew him. And I just said, well, you know, he said, will you coach me? I said, well, come down and have a look. Let's have a look. So I took the videos, front, left side, right side, front, back. I actually sent them to Dan, and Dan came back and said, good luck there. He said, you could coach this guy for 2 years and not begin to see a difference. Well, 4 or 5 years down the line now with Ian, he's won the last 3 New South Wales State Open 400-metre titles. He's run 46.3 a couple of times, which is on the way. I mean, I figure he should be running in the 45s by now, but hopefully he's going to do that this weekend at the New South Wales State Open Championships. But he has also anchored the Australian men's 4x4 team at the most recent World Championships in Doha. So whatever he does from here on in, it's not a total loss. I mean, he's been to a World Open Championships. He's won a couple of state titles. He's made a lot of friends through the sport, and I think that's really important. He is now coaching some of the other guys in our squad, and he's writing strength programs for them, not just pure gym work, but a lot of band work and such forth like that. And he came with me to ALTIS in 2019, early, and I think he learned a fair bit there. And so, yeah.
Yeah, no,
Jim,
Mike. Yeah, no, good point. I love your.
Lost my direction there for a minute.
No, it's fine. Just I love your first point about people joining your group. And I think the best quote I can ever think of is from the late Charlie Francis. And he said, part-time athletes produce part-time results. And that's my take. When I coach athletes, if I'm going to get a part-time commitment, I'm just going to expect part-time results. But if I get someone who's fully committed, then I can expect, real results. This is assuming they're over 15 years old. Anybody under 15, I make them do 2 sports, 3 sports, and preferably, speed, power, strength sports, and then they can join in later. So let's talk about the flip side. I know your group, is based in Sydney. I want to talk more about the professional side. So, so I think for those who don't know Kevin is, head coach and president of ALTIS, and ALTIS is a professional track club. Make no mistake about it, right? So Kevin, what are your thoughts about athletes who want to join your group? Let's say on this call, you have an aspiring athlete who's in the US, preferably Eastern US, and they want to join ALTIS. What's the first thing you're going to ask them? What do they need to know?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to pause for a sec. So there's some questions in the chat box about aerobic capacity. So I think we'll pick up on this when we get to the actual specific training component and the different methodologies. So we're not going to skip over that. Yeah, I think, well, Dan's name is being mentioned a lot here, but I think any good coach is going through, a very rigorous kind of briefing and debriefing process with their current athletes on a regular basis in terms of, like Mike said, understanding their desires and where they want to be and visiting where you're currently at. And similarly with an athlete coming in. So, I mean, in our case, it's interesting because, I just put a poll up on my Twitter feed last week about programming and asking coaches whether they program based on an individual basis or whether they program to the group. And it was pretty evenly split, slightly leaning towards group dynamics. And I know that some of that is contextual from the perspective that there's S&C coaches on there that are, have a little bit more ability to program individually, but pretty even split across that range. And the reason I asked that question was because it seems like every time I get into one of these intro athlete meetings, the first question I get from the athlete almost assuredly every time is, what is your program? And as we mentioned earlier, well, it depends. And so I think you can look across pretty much anyone in the world. And I can see, I used to work at Nike in sports marketing and track and field. I have good relationships with agents and coaches all around the world. And you observe these programs. And I think we often assume that there is a specific way to train. But when you look closely at these programs, you'll pretty much see the same thing, which looks like kind of a normal distribution where you'll have a few athletes that are performing really well, a couple athletes that are probably doing not very well at all, and a group that's kind of in the middle that's kind of hovering around their previous personal best or probably just off of that. And if that's largely because, when you have larger groups, people tend to train, it's easier from a management perspective to kind of have this group philosophy with small individualizations in the program. And so, what I want to do is I want to ensure that in that initial meeting that I'm able to create a relationship with the athlete that is going to allow us to have a two-way relationship. I'm not a dictatorial coach from the perspective that I expect a lot of dialogue with my athletes and I expect a lot of input from them. Now, that doesn't mean they all have to have PhDs in the event, like Dan talks about, but you want them to have the capacity to learn and to understand and to input into the program, because especially with mature athletes, they're the best source of information for their training history. They know who they've worked with historically. They know what has worked. They know what has worked during specific times of the year. And if you ask the right questions in that onboarding process, then you'll be able to glean a lot of information that will save you a lot of pain in the first 6 to 12 months of coaching them, right? You're going to get a running start because they're going to give you the clues that are going to lead you to writing the program that's appropriate to them. But like I said, sometimes athletes have been stereotyped in certain programs and they need to be, they need to move away from that for a period of time and develop some other attributes. So, ours is very much this discussion process. I met with an athlete, female athlete this year, who was interested in joining our group, subsequently didn't. And you probably tell by the first question, because the question was, what are you going to do to get me to run 47 seconds? And, I trying to be respectful, really had to bite my lip, because, I think, my question was, well, are you aware of who's run 47 seconds? And are you aware of what the world standard is now? And are you aware of what those athletes have achieved? And this is an athlete that's at quite a high level, but 47 seconds is still a reach from where they are. And that probably wasn't a good fit for our program. But, you want to understand is, what are the primary attributes that are helping that athlete perform at a high level? Right? Is there a capacity to have a solid working relationship? Are you going to be able to work with this athlete through good times and bad times? Because if you're going to have a successful program, there's going to be periods where you're challenged. And, are your personalities matching? And then, if it seems to be a good fit, and we work with a lot of athletes here that have often been on footwear contracts, that something has gone wrong in their career. And after 25 years of age, they've made a decision that their problem is too complicated and they need to go somewhere that's going to look at them a little deeper. And so Dan's historically been this kind of landmark of last resort when people have come in kind of broken. All of our coaches have a pretty good understanding of physical therapy and kind of perform, as we've kind of coined the phrase, performance therapy, and work closely with our therapists. So we're in a good position to work with more challenging cases, but it's not always easy.
Yeah, no, thanks, Kevin. So I want to go back on one of our questions here, back on methodologies. So now we got our clubs established. We got Mike's club, we got my club, we got Kevin's ALTIS club. So let's go back on methodologies. I know there's some talk about aerobic components. So let's talk about different lactate sessions for different athletes, difference in ages and differences in levels as well. So Mike, can we talk a bit about your methodologies of training 400, keeping in mind the speed, aerobic, lactate, ages? Yeah, Mike.
Just clarify what you mean by methodologies, please, Jim. No, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Kevin, you want to expand more about that topic on methodologies?
I think Mike, what he's asking is kind of your models of, he's basically referring to the concurrent model you discussed earlier. But maybe I'll kick this off, and then Mike, you want to. Okay, so I just want to address the aerobic question for a second. I mean, there is a fair amount of research that, physiologists and exercise scientists have tried to determine, the distribution between aerobic contribution and anaerobic contribution, okay? And if we're talking about a senior athlete right now, there is research that the research basically suggests that anywhere from 22% to 70% of the event, that's a massive range, is dictated by an aerobic contribution, okay? With kind of the middle point being somewhere in the 40s, for both the men and the women, okay? Now, this research is not entirely accurate. And this is where you have to be very careful about what you're reading and how you're integrating it into your program. And so I can tell you firsthand from experience that the aerobic contribution has played very little part in the male athletes that I've worked with, okay? And being in Canada, often your training environments dictate the type of program and methodology that you're able to use. And so when I was coaching Shane Nemi, who was the first Canadian to break 45 seconds, and he ran 44:86, he was second at the Commonwealth Games in 2002. We lived in Vancouver one year, and there's no indoor tracks there, and it rains a lot. So, you would have a season where we would do a fair amount of extensive tempo, and there was a fair amount of aerobic involvement. And then we moved to Toronto the subsequent year. He literally ran the same performances each year. And in the Toronto scenario, because we were on a 200-meter indoor track, we did hard surface. We did very little aerobic work at all. And so, that doesn't mean that he didn't have some attributes that had been developed from the previous year that hadn't carried over. but that wasn't the primary thing that was driving his performance. And, I think, there, as you said, this is a continuum, and there may be windows of opportunity for certain athletes, but at the highest levels of performance with the men in particular, I don't think that it is a significant contributor to their performance. Now, what the research basically has shown, though, is that, the biggest trend there is that the slower the performance, the bigger the aerobic contribution. And this is what Jimson was talking about. So if you have research studies that are looking at males that have run 50 flat on average and women that have run 60 seconds, well, surely the aerobic contribution is going to be a lot higher. It's very different for someone who's running 43 or 49 seconds. The aerobic contribution with women tends to be higher, okay, than it is with men. And that could just be because they actually are running longer, but also because they don't have the ability to create the type of anaerobic power that the men do, just because of sheer muscle mass. Okay. And then again, there's a difference whether the athlete is a more sprint-based dominant athlete or a more endurance-dominated athlete. So if you have like an 800-meter runner that's not quite as fast, then they're probably going to derive more of their performance is going to be derived from aerobic qualities. But that doesn't mean that they're going to be world-class in the event. Okay, so you have an individual in front of you. You just have to consider what their attributes are, where their windows of opportunity are. And I would just, say, like I said, I think the work that Gareth Sanford's done around the 800 meters is instructive in this area. But I would encourage everyone to kind of look at this with a grain of salt. Mike, you can answer this, and then I'll come back to the other methodological questions.
If you're talking, yep. Yeah, Jimson, if we're talking program theory or methods, as I said, I designed my program based on the needs of my athletes, nobody else. And I called it concurrent theory or concurrent program design. And essentially, it's a series of little triangles or arrowheads stacked one upon the other. And I would like to think it's vertically integrated so that we're concentrating on speed development from day one and working all the way through, so that we're working in little microcycles, lots of them, 2.5 weeks of maybe what you might loosely call strength and endurance, followed by 2.5 weeks of what you might call speed and power. And then usually there's a week of resting and testing, mostly resting. And within the weekly cycles, I work on a weekly cycle, we go usually 2 days on, 1 day off, 3 days on, 1 day off, and we repeat that cycle, that rhythm. And after a rest day, so let's say Saturday's a rest day during the off season in the general prep phase, Saturday would be a rest day, Sunday would be a high velocity day, a speed day, and Monday would be an endurance day, so stress recovery. It might be 5 or 6 by 200 meters with a 200-meter jog recovery for 400 meters. We're trying to take care of say on day one, we're looking after the front end of the 400, hopefully, the first 200 or 300 meters. And day two, we're looking after what comes after the 300, so the last part of the race. So we're kind of taking a shot at it. And so shot at both ends of the spectrum, so the speed end and the endurance end. And we're trying to cover our bases and not leave too long between it. So it's maximum 2.5 weeks between, endurance and also maximum velocity. And that's in general prep. And we might repeat that cycle 2 or 3 times. So each little macro cycle would be 6 weeks. And we try to see how many we can get in. With a senior international athlete, you might only get 2 in, and suddenly you've got to start to sharpen up because the domestic season's upon you. and you've got to start running to be selected for the next big team, next big meet. So after, usually after, if we were just using one cycle, we would go 6 weeks of that, and then we'd go into a transition period of 1 month where the work becomes even more specific to racing. And we right from the start, whenever we're on the track, we are trying to simulate the sort of speeds that are specific to the 400, and we try to work on a rhythm that's no slower than the slowest 100-meter segment of your 400, and that's going to be the last 100. So in Darren Clark's case, when he set his record, I think what did he run? He ran 11.83 electric for the last 100 of his 4 at the Olympics, and Marie ran what did she run? 13.25 for her last 100 of a 50.2. So the endurance side of it, the stuff like 5 or 6 200s, we would do those in the speed of the last half of your race. So, for example, we tried to get Darren to run 44 flat. So we trained to run 21 seconds for the first 200 and 23 seconds for the backup 200s. That's a 2-second differential, and that's pretty standard for the 400 for men and for women, although because of the endurance work that we put in, which was probably more like 800-meter work. So we would do 5 or 6 200s for Marie in 25 or 26 seconds, because her race model was out in 24, home in 26. So let's try and do 5 or 6 reps in 26. It's hard to do it. You get to level the 3rd rep and everything's looking great. Then you do the 4th rep and the wheels start to fall off. And by the time you hit the 5th rep, it's really painful. These people are sprinters. They're not 800-meter runners. They're not milers. If you ask an elite miler to run, 5 or 6 200s in 23, I would imagine that it would be no problems whatsoever for them. But they can't sprint 21 seconds for a 200, even if their life depended on it. So you're dealing with a particular kind of animal who wants to sprint, doesn't want to run slowly ever. It's not in their mentality for the most part. And so Darren his 6.2s were all in 23, and 2 of those, I think, just before the Seoul Olympics, were in the 22s, mid to high 22s. He's in a one-off run. He ran hand-timed 3-step walk-up 19.8, 10 days before the first round of the 4. Marie, 10 days before the first round of her 400 in Seoul, she was in Japan in the middle of a rainstorm, and she ran 22.83 electric, which is pretty good. And so it showed that the short speed was in place, the intermediate speed was pretty good, and the come-home speed was also pretty good. The differentials, as I said, 2 seconds is pretty standard. Marie's differential was 1.36, and her differential was, I think, the best of any of the women at Seoul. And Darren's differential was 1.22 seconds, and that's right up there as well. So, they didn't win medals. Things went wrong in the final. Things went wrong well before we got to the games, but they pulled it together, in the last couple of months, and I'm proud of what they did. Darren went on to the Commonwealth Games and addressed a shortcoming in his competitive record when he won the gold medal in Auckland, New Zealand, in 44.60. And people said, well, you don't run much beyond 300 metres, so your guys aren't going to be able to finish the race. They certainly won't be able to run the rounds. And in those days, there were 4 rounds of the 400. So Darren ran, he won every round, all 4 of them, and ran 44.60 in the final, which was his 4th 400 race in exactly 28 hours. And that was 1990. And no other Australian has yet run 44.60, much less 44.3.
So, Jimson, I'm just going to pick up on this a little bit. Thanks, Mike. I think that when we go back to the methodological question here around the 400 meters, that you have to look at the nature of the event. And I know I can see that there's some comments lighting up around training females versus males, and we can get to that issue. But right now, from pure methodological and like looking at the various models, if you look at the 400 meters at an event, and let's say we compare it to the 100 meters, the 100 meters now is largely dictated by the athlete's ability to hit a peak maximum velocity, right? Usain Bolt was in excess of 12 meters a second, right? So it pretty much negates the speed endurance component of the 100 meters. And this is something that Charlie Francis talked about a lot, that there was very little decrement in the maximal running velocity of the 100-meter athletes in the last 10 to 20 meters of the race, and that any gains that could be made there were going to be marginal. That didn't mean that you didn't need to train speed endurance, but the max velocity and all of the factors that went into developing max velocity were the important attributes that you needed to be focusing on. Okay. The 400 meters is a different puzzle, because even if you look at a man that runs about 44.0 in the 400 meters, their average velocity is somewhere around 9 meters a second. Well, there's no chance that that man is never going to be able to run 9 meters a second at any particular point of the year. Of course they can. Many of them, like, you know, we talked about Fred Curley earlier, is hitting like over 11.5 meters a second in the 100 meters. So if he only needs to average 9 meters a second, he's clearly, even if he's not in peak condition in October, November in the Northern Hemisphere at the start of our training season, he's still going to be well above that 9 meters a second. Now, what that means is it gives you the flexibility to approach and structure your season and your training program differently and based on the specific needs of the athlete. Okay, that's an important consideration there. There isn't necessarily a fixed model. There's different ways to come about this. Yes, we want to develop speed reserve, right? But we can go about that by either focusing on short acceleration work at the beginning of the year, or we can go about it by focusing on more enduring qualities early in the year. Now, Mike talked a little bit about vertical integration, so I think it's probably important for everyone to understand that within more modern training methodologies now, you're pretty much training all of the different attributes all the time. When we talk about these different models, we're talking about what your priorities are during these periods. Okay, if we're focusing more on enduring components at the beginning of the season, we're still training acceleration. We're probably still doing hill work where we're working on speed, strength, or power, right? So it's the emphasis that you're placing on these different training attributes at different times of the year. So there's pretty much 4 kind of models and 4 different ways to approach the 400 meters. If you look back historically, and Jim Bush was a big figure here, Bud Winter on the West Coast developed a lot of high quality sprinters. Now John Smith came through that program. That approach what I consider to be a more traditional approach. So essentially what they were doing is they were focusing on volume at the beginning of the year. And as they moved through the season, they would intensify. So the volume would come down and the intensities would go up. This is a traditional methodology. There's some limitations to this methodology in that you spend a significant period of time away from speed, okay, because you're working on slower, longer distances for extended periods of time. Most programs now are not going that far away for speed for that long. So if you imagine the old periodization models where you had your general prep and your specific prep periods that would be almost dominated with longer endurance type work. And within the 400 meters, we're talking intensive tempo largely, with the intensities anywhere from 75 to 90% intensity. That's where they're characterized by that. Then we came to these models that were more based on what the Eastern Europeans were doing, that were more speed-based models, okay? And within the speed-based models, there's two ways to approach it. Now, you'll hear this used interchangeably, and I think it probably needs clarifying, but there's a short to long program, which is start with acceleration work and build up your speed quality, your speed distances over the course of the year. And there's a long to short program. Long to short is interchangeably used with the traditional methodology. I don't think that's accurate. I think for clarification's sake, it's important to understand that the long to short program, long to short describes your speed qualities. So that could be, say, starting the season with 2 intensive 600 meters as your special endurance work, and then working down. Okay. Now, at the end of the day, after 13 or 12 weeks, so however long that preparation period is, all of these athletes are roughly going to be doing the same kind of thing. They're going to kind of meet around this area of doing highly intensive 3 to 350 meter runs, because those are the activities that look the closest to the 400 meter event and that have high levels of specificity and reflect the demands that are on the event. So the difference here is how you're arriving at that work. Are you starting with short acceleration work and building up into longer speed work, or are you starting with longer speed work, more in the special endurance, speed endurance area and working downwards? Okay. Now, Mike's also talked about a concurrent method, and we talked about onboarding athletes. And I think if you have an older athlete and you're not exactly sure where to start, the concurrent method is pretty good. And the way I would describe that is essentially you're spreading out the density of the speed work. Okay, so we're not doing necessarily 3 really high intensive speed sessions a week. We might have 1 or 2 sessions where we're working more on intensive tempo, right? So we have an intensive tempo focus throughout the season. Now, the nice thing about this, working this 80 to 90% zone, is that, that there's a lot of, we're working, anaerobic power, anaerobic capacity, things that are required for the 400 meters, right? We're also, for athletes that don't have a nervous system that's capable of taking the demands of more frequent speed exposure, that gives them a little bit of a rest, okay? But it also allows you to cover all of your bases, right? Because you're doing your acceleration work, you're doing your speed, you're doing speed endurance, and you're doing your intensive tempo. Okay. And if you're not sure where you should be with an athlete, that's a good place to start, because you kind of have everything covered and you're not going to mess it up massively, right? Because they're going to be generally fit because you've done pretty much everything. So those are kind of the 4 approaches to the event. And now when we talk about young athletes, as Jimson has said, the most important thing is to understand where they need to be. And on the men's side, if the men are running 10 flat, 20 flat, say, and I've had 2 guys that have ran 30.8 in practice from a standing start over 300 meters, 31 flat, 31.5, 31.8, 31.6. These are very common times. Okay. You can tell that, that is something that you need to be working towards. And so with a younger athlete, there's an opportunity to develop those qualities. But I don't want to get too far off here on this, but I think that there is, within moderation and depending upon their age and stage of development, some opportunities to start to tap into some of the more specific endurance qualities. But there's probably a different conversation, because I know we could just keep talking on this, and it's not the purpose of this call.
No, good point. Actually, Mike, before you go, so I think the underlying thing we need to understand is that every workout you do has to have a purpose. There's a reason why you do a certain workout. And that's my first question I have before I even work out or I prescribe a workout. Now, going back to the question on aerobic conditioning, yeah, I don't intentionally do a long run or doing aerobics. However, the other day I did a max V workout, and it left me trash for like 2 days. So on day 2 after the workout, instead of doing nothing, I was better off going out for a 20-minute run, some strides, some stretching. So that's what I do. So I think whatever you do, aerobic conditioning, okay, you can still do it, but blend it in the workout, blend it in your tempos. Instead of doing 10 times 100 walk back, you can do 10 times 100 jog back. Or we can do what we did with Kevin, turnarounds or greyhounds, 100, slow down, turn around, go back. That was my first time doing a turnaround, Kevin, with you guys. I've never, ever heard that program before. We always walk back and we would talk to each other and chit chat. So yeah, there is room for aerobic conditioning, but just blend it in. Don't make them run 40 minutes on a Sunday morning or do 1,000 burpees. Yeah, so that's my take on that. Mike, you had something to add to what Kevin said?
Yeah, I was just going to say, with that vertical integration component, I'd like to see whatever you're working on in week 1 is going to be there in week 52. You're trying to work all the concurrently develop all the threads of performance. So speed, stamina, strength, skill, if you like, psychology. You're trying to work on all of these things concurrently, and it can be done with respect to the aerobic component. So if I still want to get a relatively specific workout the day after a high speed day and they're fairly trashed, we might do 4 by 60 meter turnaround, rapid turnaround, but it's not fast. And, it's about 8 seconds per 60 meters. That's not real fast. And then straight into a 200 and run as hard as you can for the 200. And what happens is, what we find is that what the reporting from those who do that session is that it feels like the last half of the last 200 of 400. So it's, I think, still aerobic, but there is the threshold involved in it. That's all.
Yeah, Jim, just to pick up there too, and what you were saying is that with some of this work and around kind of like, extensive tempo. Okay. I think when you're structuring your program, you've done a needs assessment on the athlete. You're looking at their strengths. You're looking at the areas of opportunity, and you're going to structure your week around the priorities. And so let's just say, like on a standard typical model, it's like probably Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday are 3 big days. Okay. Now someone's asking if you're structuring your week around Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. Okay. And so you're going to put your primary qualities in.
I can't.
And again, Jimson,
I'm trying to unmute him. I'm trying to unmute him, but he's gone.
Okay. You're going to structure the program Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and you're going to decide what attributes you want to train on those days. So not untypically, depending on your primary approach, they're all going to be relatively intensive days. And you have to make a decision on what you're going to do on the in-between days. And that's where extensive tempo can be useful. The way we would make a decision around what we're going to do on the off days is what's the priority of that work during this period? And how does it potentially interfere with the primary quality that we're trying to train on any of the other days, right? So, you probably don't want to do like a really intensive speed session that's neurologically fatiguing on Tuesday and then come back and try and run some kind of specific endurance on Wednesday, right? I mean, that might be an advanced technique for somebody that's running at a very high level that needs to be able to run rounds at a major championships, but it's probably not from a long-term strategy the best approach. So, we're looking at what the primary qualities are that we want to train on those 3 days, and then, how do we fit the other work in around it?
Yeah, no, good point. So I think a next question that this leads up to is, what's a typical training week look like? So maybe that's a 2-part question. We got a training week in the block of, say, training, and then maybe we'll jump later to the training week, say 2 weeks before a major competition. So I think for me, I have 3 different types of training blocks that I use. So in college, I would go Monday, Wednesday, Friday, because I'm in school Monday, Wednesday, Friday, as well as Tuesday, Thursday. And then I have Tuesday, Thursday as easy days. And then the weekends was full recovery or active recovery. So 3 days a week, easy. The second one that I started doing for a while was, Monday, Tuesday, back to back. And then it was 4 days a week. It was Monday, Wednesday, the day rest, and then Friday, Saturday, back to back. But that Friday session was a speed session, and that Saturday session, since you have time, it was a longer special endurance session, and you didn't tax the system at all when you have that kind of back to back. I'm not a big fan of back to back training, especially hard training or fast training, but that's just me. And then the third session, which I do now, a third type of training block that I do now, is only twice a week, because as masters athletes, you need a lot of time to recover. And we do Wednesdays and then either Saturday or Sunday. So you always have 2 days rest between hard workouts. And then the weekends are usually the longer workouts, the longer speed endurance workouts, full recoveries. And then Wednesday, for those who still work, have, day jobs, that's another session where you try to prioritize. So yeah, so you go 3 days a week, 4 days a week, or 2 days a week. Those are my three options, depending on the age of the athlete, the school they're in, whether they have jobs, or whether if they're over like 50, 60 with masters. That's the kind of training plan that we do. And I think we've discussed, what we do in those training plans. Kevin, you want to comment on the...
Okay. Our classic training week, so if you're in a traditional specific preparation period, would be, the Tuesday is probably going to be some form of speed or speed endurance. Okay. If we're running a more concurrent program that I just described earlier, then Thursday is going to be more of an intensive tempo day, where we're training somewhere between 80 and 85% intensity. And Saturday is going to look more like specific endurance. So things that look like the 400 meters. Okay. Now, what I have found, and this is my experience, and having worked with both high-level men and high-level women, and I've spoken to, I've had more, I would say that I've probably had more high-quality men in my program, is that the men typically have, typically do better with 3 intensive sessions a week. Now, this is a stereotype, okay? But typically, if I had to classify the men, typically do better with 3 intensive sessions a week. Whereas there is probably, you will find more women that are able to run fairly intensively 4 times a week, okay? And the reasons for that, whether that's, the male's ability to express power and tap into kind of higher nervous system stimulus, and the amount of time that it takes to recover. But I think also the nature of the event, as Jimson said earlier, because it is inherently shorter, even at a world-class level, it's anywhere from 5 to 6 seconds shorter for the men. And so we are exercising for a shorter period of time. Okay. But what I found is that there are a large number of men that are able to perform really well on a short to long program or a speed-based approach. Okay. I would argue that there's probably fewer women that are able to do that. And I would think, from my experience, I've kind of thought about this a lot, is like, I've probably seen about 20% of the females that come through my program that are able to respond really well to a speed-based approach. Often what happens with them is they look really good to 300, 350 meters when on a speed-based approach, and they don't have enough volume in the program to finish the race. Now, I had a young woman when I was at the University of Oklahoma, and she was 3rd at the NCAA championships one year as a sophomore. She ran 51.3 when she was 19. And she had like over 3 meters standing long jump. She had an incredible vertical, 5-step bound, was all really good. I mean, she was very capable of going out and running, 7:30 in the 60 meters. She ran 22.6 for 200. And she could drop 17 second, sub 17.5, 150s repeatedly, and not uncommon for her to do a workout, special endurance wise, would look like 2 300s and 36 flat with 20 minutes rest and then go home. Right. But if you don't have those type of speed qualities, then, there's a focus there with that athlete and be able to develop speed reserve through a speed-based approach. Other athletes are going to need more volume and are going to work more from an intensive tempo perspective. So we kind of structure our week, and the Tuesday would be that kind of speed endurance, moving to like a kind of more of an intensive tempo oriented session on the Thursday, then towards more of a speed special endurance approach on the Saturday. There's a number. I have two women that have run at a very high level in my program right now, and they both came from high performance programs that only trained 4 days a week. Okay, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. Okay, the program is relatively intensive, and it seems if they trained 4 days a week like that and they had 3 days off, they did quite well. Okay. That hasn't always been our approach. You know, we typically are doing more regenerative type work on Wednesdays and Fridays. And with a lot of the women in our group, we'll do some kind of moderate intensive tempo on Monday, setting us up for the speed endurance work. But again, a lot of this depends on the age and stage of the athlete you're working with, and importantly, the environment that you're in. If you're in Edmonton and there's 6 feet of snow outside of the building and you have a 140 meter straightaway or 100 meter straightaway to work with, you're going to structure both your methodology and your microcycles differently than you would be if you're living in Phoenix or if you're living where we are now in Atlanta, because the weather is going to allow you to do things differently and the environment allows you to do things differently.
Yeah, good question. So Mike, your microphone is working. You want to chime in on a typical training week for your concurrent method?
Well, a training week at the moment, we're only training 4 sessions a week. So we would go, Sunday would be high intensity speed work, block starts, timed effort runs, and, you know, maybe a ladder, something like a 320 and a bunch of 60s coming off the turn, pretty much close to maximum speed. But it could be anything. It could be a 200 plus a 200 of race modeling, where you try to set up the speed of the first 200 that you want to run off crouch start, take 2 minutes break, and then do a running start on the backup 200 and aim to negative split. And that's what my best athletes have always been able to do. And when they could do that, I knew they were ready to rock and roll. But we would go high speed, high one day, low the next day in terms of intensity, then take a day off, repeat on, say, Wednesday and Thursday. And then Friday would be, and Saturday would be off, and train again on Sunday. But on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they would still be doing, and sometimes other days, they would be doing some kind of gym work or rehab work. On the days off would be the days that they become normal people and they go and do the shopping, they do whatever they need to do, catch up with friends, catch up with family, just organise things, get into a competition period, particularly in the last 10 days leading up to, say, an important meet. We might go 1 day on, 1 day off, like that. We don't do backup days. Sometimes we do, but mostly we don't. We want them to be as fresh as we can, or as they can. And we work on maybe the day before they race. Some people really like to have maybe 1 or 2 days off if they're coming into a tournament where they know they've got 2 or 3 rounds. And then the day before the first round, we'll do some race modelling, just to restore rhythm, the rhythm of the race. So a lot of the work that we try to do is in the rhythm of the race. But particularly leading into a major tournament, rhythm's really, really important. It cannot be, overestimated how important it is. It's the glue that ties all the other strings of performance together.
No, yeah, absolutely. And for those who aren't familiar with Mike and the Fast Track 400, his whole program is transparent. It's on Facebook. It's a private group, but you can join. Every workout, every split, everything he does is there. Every video is there. There's no hiding. There's no secret. There's no magic potions. It's all there. Highly recommend if you're on Facebook. Check it out and just feel free to add comments. So before I get to the role of strength training, the 400, I know that's a big, big topic. You know, when you do, what kind of weight training do you do before or after? I want to just talk about the training week leading up to a major competition. And that's because there's a question on the chat about intensive tempos. How many sessions would be ideal leading up to, say, a competition, if any. So, so for me, I think if you're going long to short method, I think it's really important you do whatever you got to do to stay fresh, but you also want to do enough speed work, but not to the point where you blow them out, where you get injuries. We've seen some disasters, people getting injured right up to the week of the meet. But for me, the thing is, you got to keep it fresh. Like Mike said, you got to keep them recovered and fresh. The only difference is that I've noticed over the years is that the decreasing the work volume, whatever you do, can lead to weight gain for some athletes, because some athletes are so used to doing 2,000 meters every session of tempo, and they do their weights and they do this. But the minute you lead up to the meet, they start working out less, and you really got to watch out for the volume. And I think that's where extensive tempo, some 10 times 100 turnarounds, you got to keep that up to speed, because you don't want them getting too lazy. And the thing is with travel, travel is not a rest day. People think, oh, I'm traveling today. No. Traveling is not a rest day. Often, and actually mandatory, if we have an early morning flight, as soon as you land, the first thing we do is get to the track and go for a workout. It's not a full workout, but you got to flush the legs, because they've been sitting on a plane, they've been dehydrated on a flight. So that's the kind of things I watch out for in my point. Kevin, you want to talk about the training week leading up to a competition? Is there anything you want to share on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends, like you said, is the approach that you're taking with the athlete and the model that you're following, right? I think the first thing, you don't want to be introducing anything new in that final phase preparation that lasts 10 to 14 days. That's not the time to be experimenting. You're consolidating around the attributes that you've been developing with the athlete over a period of time. And ideally, you're playing to their strengths, right? Because confidence is a big factor when it comes to competition. So I think those are some overriding principles there. In general, probably our last intensive session is still probably going to be about 10 days out. That's probably going to be a speed-based session that's going to be performed at 100% intensity. And everything inside of that window is going to be, the intensity is going to be dropped on the speed runs to about 95%. Although, we probably do some specific endurance 7 to 8 days before the race that is at a high quality, but because of the length of the run, it's below 100% max velocity, right? So it's not totally taxing the nervous system. The objective in this period is to get the nervous system into a place where it's ready to perform and it's fresh, right? So we're dropping volumes and we're dropping intensities inside that last 8 days, right? But the density is relatively staying the same. The density, is the frequency of our training, right? So we're probably still hitting something fairly intensively every second day, but the volume is down and the intensity is just under peak threshold. But with major competitions, you would be surprised how little a lot of athletes are doing. But as Jimson just said, if you have an athlete that has specific issues, then you may have to cater the training in that final block to what those specific issues are. I rember when I was the head coach of the British junior team going to the 2010 World Junior Championships, we had an athlete that put 12 pounds on in the holding camp, okay? And you can imagine how they performed, right? So, and their coach wasn't there, didn't have the ability to be there. And so that situation happened. So, but that's largely how we're approaching things. But, there's some athletes, I have a 29-year-old woman right now that just ran a 6/10 PR indoors. And we largely trained through this week. I think the last 3 days we kind of tapered the program off a little bit, but because she's new and I've only been working with her for 4 or 5 months, the conversation was around, what she said to me was, I tend to race better when I'm training through competitions and my loads are higher. And so, based on what I see with her, that kind of made sense to me. So we gave that a shot and, she was able to drop a pretty significant performance. So, every athlete's different. And again, like I started this conversation, it's really important to be having conversations with your athletes around their preferences, because there is a very large, I don't say psychological component to this, but you want them to be in a very positive, confident state when they're entering, in particular, a major competition.
Good points. I didn't want to mention names in that, but yeah, I was referring to those holding camps and training camps leading up to the big games. People do gain weight, which is normal because they're not working out as much, and you have unlimited food. A funny story to share was back in the '84 Olympics in LA when China competed, and back then, I guess the food conditions in China was, were marginal or dietary. They came to LA and they had unlimited food in the buffet tables. They had like anyone here who's coached at the Olympic level know the Olympic Village, the cafeteria is a gold mine. You can eat to the heart's galore, eat as much as you want, what you want, when you want, whatever you want. And that's what was a big danger. I'm surprised they actually ran well or jumped well in '84, but that's a funny story. One thing before I go to Mike, actually, one thing I liked about Ottawa, one of Canadian city, where when they have nationals, they would always have an all-comers meet 10 days before. On the Wednesday night before the big meet, they have a track meet, a local all-comers meet. And that's a perfect time, 10 days out before your big competition. I would drop my, everything and race. My athletes would race because 10 days is a perfect time to start, decompressing and just getting ready for that taper. Mike, thoughts on your typical training week leading up to a big competition?
Mostly we would aim to do a time trial or a fully peaked up race 10 days out, but it could be 11 or it could be 9, just the way things fall. But thereafter, we would tend to sort of stay submax right through, except for the very short distances. So we might do 20, 30, 40, 50, even 60 metres and start running PBs. But we're still trying to stay relaxed. But if you've got the taper right, I think you get fast times and you don't really have to try. It's just and also the environment and anticipating the occasion can really elevate an athlete's performances, even though you're not looking. You're saying, don't go hard, and yet you run a stream of PBs at these shorter distances. Yeah. But they don't tend to sort of damage you. So we would be doing standing and flying starts, not much out of the blocks, maybe some 3 points. But the PBs were coming because, when you're ready, you're ready. And but 10 days out, we'd be looking for, as I said, Darren Clark had a 200-metre scheduled. He ran 19.8, hand-timed, off a 3-step walk-up. That's what I always try to do with all of the athletes. Doesn't work with all of them, and then we go usually to a 1 day on, 1 day off basis, and we try to don't chase the therapists too hard. Just keep it normal. Don't suddenly have 400 massages if you're used to having one a month. You go into your race, and it depends. In the 400, obviously, it depends to some degree on the weather elements and the conditions as to what you're doing. But pretty much you're going to go out and go hard for a pretty solid 300, and then maybe somewhere around that point reappraise the situation and see if you can just ease down or whether you still need to keep going, because some people have to run a PB in their heat at the Olympics just to get out of the heat, just to survive the second round. And in fact, now that they've eliminated one round and it's a 3-round meet for most people, making the semi-finals is quite an achievement, and a lot of people can't back up what they did the previous round. I'm hoping that the work we've done has pretty much always enabled my athletes on this program to continue to run fast right through the rounds.
Yeah, you mentioned 11 or 9 days taper, and I totally agree with you, because when there was 4 rounds, that first round can be, for like Wade Van Niekerk, he can jog it, right? That doesn't really count. Whereas another athlete, they have to run a PB to get to the next round. So definitely you have to.
Yeah. I want to jump in here quickly. I mean, this is a question that can drive you insane, because people will talk about, well, we need the ability to be able to run the rounds, but actually what you need is you need the ability to be able to run the qualifying standard first. Then you need the ability to be able to run a first round well. So don't put the cart before the horse, right? It's like you're trying to develop the athlete. You need a patient approach over a number of years with an athlete, right? We're not going to be able to, there's no magic workout that is going to get us into a position where this athlete's going to be able to magically run 3 rounds. What you'll notice is the athletes that are performing, and I've actually done some research in this area statistically, the athletes performing the best in the final round of the competition are the athletes that have been running more sub-maximally in the opening rounds, right? So in Wade Van Niekerk's case, if he can run 45.2 in the first round and he has a PR of 43 flat, that is not an intensive effort for him, right? And we have to be careful when we're taking athletes to major championships, because Mike alluded to the fact there's a high level of stimulus. And in the 400, it's one of the first environments you're going to go into at a major championships where there's a stadium and there's no wind. So the conditions are faster. The track surfaces are faster, and the athletes are generally tapered. So they're ready to run quickly and their adrenaline is pumping. And I've seen this multiple times. And I remember seeing an Australian boy at Osaka in 2007 who had been injured, came into the first round and dropped a 44 point. And I turned to the guy that I was coaching and said, that's him, he's done. And he ran a little bit slower in the semifinal and wasn't close to making the final because it was actually in the semi that the guys took off, So, you have to, this is a classic. They dropped 44 seconds in the first round, come off the track, talk to the cameras and go, that was so easy. I can't wait to get to the next round. And so when I really try, and then they end up running slower. And it's because all those conditions have allowed them to run that time very easily, but the metabolic cost and the cost on the nervous system, running a PR that early in the rounds, they're not able to recover within 24 hours. And so, basically race distribution and energy management through the rounds is an important point. But the main thing you need is the capacity to be able to run sub-maximally at that level. If you're running PRs in the first or second round, you're not going to progress.
That's where speed reserve also plays a big factor in my view. So, if you're running pretty close to a PB in the first round, there's nothing left. But if you've got tons of speed and you can jog a high 45 or a high 44, that's fine. You're laughing. If you can run 44.3 and the requirement for you to get through is 45.3, you're probably sitting in a good position as long as you just don't overcook it. It's just my opinion.
Do we want to jump into the weight training sessions before we have like half hour left?
Sure.
I think that's a good place to go, and then maybe open up the floor for questions. Start taking some questions up.
Okay, so definitely. So weight training before or after your track workout. I know people like John Smith and Clyde Hart, they do it before. They do it at 9 a.m. before their 11 o'clock, track workout. I'm not a big fan of it for some reason. I just like it because my main purpose of running track is to run track. I want to run fast. The weight is just an extra to make me faster, to work other muscles that I don't work during my running. But for me, it's always been after. Ideally, you have a weight facility right next to your track. You don't have to travel half hour to Gold's Gym or World's Gym. Everything is there. Kevin, thoughts on before or after a track workout?
Definitely after. Yeah. Again, this is a huge question. This is a massive question. So, we could spend hours on this. In terms of lifting and what the role that plays, so just to give you some observations, I have 2 athletes that I've worked with have run 43 seconds. They didn't run 43 seconds with me, just to be clear there, and 49 seconds similarly. And both of them were able to run those performances without lifting. Okay. And so you have to ask yourself, what is it you're trying to achieve with this athlete? Okay. And typically there's athletes, high quality 400 meter runners tend to produce a lot of force elastically. right? There's stored energy through that stretch reflex, right? And I think it probably comes at a lower energy cost. And so they're able to essentially bounce their way around the track, okay? That is force that is produced differently than kind of the concentric motion where the muscle is shortening, right? And what we think of with kind of classic concentric lifting techniques, okay? So if you have a very powerful athlete that is more of a jumper type, that is classified as a puller, that is able to bounce around the track, it may be that they don't need to lift, okay? Jeremy Warner did very little lifting. He largely did circuit training, okay? So there's a whole number of considerations around this area. Now, there's others that can benefit from this. And if we're working with younger athletes, this absolutely plays a role in developing the ability to express force and developing resilience and developing sound movement patterns. But if you're working with a mature population, the most important thing first is that the athlete is able to move through the movement patterns that you are going to prescribe unweighted. Okay. I've had 3 extremely prominent athletes come to us with herniated discs in their back from back squatting loads that should have never been on their back. Okay. And typically with a lot of 400-meter runners, they tend to be longer, they tend to be more wiry, and they tend not to move well through these kind of functional movement patterns. So it's important first that we're basically establish those functional movement patterns, and we're sure that the athlete's able to move through that range of motion before we load them. Okay. Now, when we are lifting, there's probably a discussion to be had around whether you're trying to develop some kind of strength endurance or speed endurance through your lifting protocols. That's not something that we do. It's not something that Charlie Francis did. That's not something that Dan Papp does. We're basically trying to develop maximal force, and then we use the sprinting and the running, to develop the endurance. Okay, so we're working on maximal force expression in the weight room. I think there's also a consideration there is, when we talk about when we're doing it, is like, how is that lifting program impacting the primary quality that you're trying to train on the track? Because first and foremost, if we've decided that speed is the most important component for this particular athlete, then how is that strength work going to complement that speed, or more importantly, interfere with that speed? Okay, that speed development. And so these are all the considerations that have to go into, whether or not you're lifting, when you're lifting, and the type of lifting you're doing. Now, Paul Dedewo, who was number 3 in the world in 2018, he won the World Cup. He's until recently, until Stephen Gardner ran mid 31 in the 300s. Paul had the number 3 indoor 300 performance ever at 31:91, 31:92. Essentially got him to a place where we would use a trap bar deadlift, and he was able to do doubles or triples at 2.5 times his body weight. I mean, that's more than enough strength for a 400-meter runner. He felt confident when he was able to move that kind of weight. And then in terms of like whether we would ascend the complexity of the lifts, it really comes down to the athlete's skill level and the amount of time and energy that you have to teach in that particular skill. Because when we start to move towards Olympic lifts, there's absolutely a use for them, but there's not a use for them if the athlete's technique is horrible and they're potentially going to injure themselves through the exercise.
Yeah, we talked forever on that. Mike, you want to chime in on your experiences on weight rooms?
I think a strong athlete is a confident athlete. I think that for me, the weightlifting can either help or hinder track performance. I have tried to, at one point we were obliged to do our weightlifting or gym sessions before the track work because we couldn't get on a damn track afternoon. So we did our gym work in the morning, and everything was compromised. The weight program was compromised because you were trying to save. You didn't want to overdo it because you knew you were going to be required to sprint in the afternoon. And so And then you couldn't sprint maximally because you were still sore from the session in the morning if you were fully committed in the gym. So basically everything was compromised. Therefore, I don't like doing it. The weights before the track, and we've tried to avoid that ever since. Lifting steel, raising the bar is not the only kind of strength training. It's not the only kind of explosive strength training. There's a lot of work that can be done with, the rubber bands and things like that. If we're in the gym, I've done my basic Olympic weightlifting coaching course degree, and we have worked in the past with an Australian Olympic team head coach for weightlifting. So the athletes that I've been working with for several years now are all accomplished lifters. They're technically very good. They can do snatches, clean and jerk, deadlifts, pretty much without a problem. Squats, I'm not sure how terrific they are. I suppose they are, but I want something that's more ballistic. But also because of a lot of the people I work with have got university or they've got work to do. They can't spend too much time in the gym. And so the ability to say do a very good session of power cleans or clean and jerk or snatches particularly, you're getting a whole body integrated strength program, and I love that. I think it transfers reasonably well to the track, and you can get in and out of the gym in 15 minutes, 10 minutes if needs be. The other kind of work that I like to do is we like to do a bit of hill work, short hills, long hills. I like to do a lot of skipping, like linear skipping for height and for speed. For height and for length. And just alternate skipping, not hard, but it looks like a classic sprint position that you're assuming when you do that. And it's not a race really so much. It's a nice, powerful stroking sprint action that you're generating, and it teaches young people to use their arms, because when they use their arms, they go further or they go higher. So, the same applies with your sprints. If you use your arms, you go a little bit faster. Anyway, so that's my take on it.
Yeah,
I think Mike's raising an important point here. I mean, if you're taking a needs-based approach with your athlete and you're trying to problem solve, okay, and I think with any stimulus that you're putting in the program, any kind of exercise you're putting in the program, you're looking at what is the need? What am I trying to improve here? You're not just doing it randomly, and you're asking yourself how it's going to transfer. Okay, these are big questions and big topics. Okay, so from a sprinting perspective, the force application time is very short. It's under 1/10 of a second. It is impossible to mirror that with any type of resisted activity. Okay, force application times in any kind of strength speed or maximal strength work are much longer. So it's important to understand kind of these force velocity curves, but knowing that if we can impact an athlete with an exercise at one point in the force velocity curve, it should bring up all the other levels on the force velocity curve. Okay, and now from a developmental perspective, this is starting to get very complicated, but it's important to be aware of this because you need to understand why you're doing what you're doing and when you're doing it. Okay, and so to Mike's point here is that we have sprinting on one end of the curve, and then let's say we have maximal lifts where force application is really high through say a hex bar deadlift or something for an extended period of time, right? And that might even be tempo based, okay, where we're actually slowing the lift down. Okay, and then we have all these activities in between. And so we're asking ourselves, how are these things going to transfer with the athlete that is in front of us? And so there's other things that we can do. So I have this woman that I'm talking about that's 29 that just ran this 6'10" PR. Okay, I can see she's actually 5'3". Okay, so you look at her and think she's not going to have much of a stride length, but she's very deceptive because she has she's able to produce force concentrically, and she's a pusher. And when she is strong, she's able to displace her hip through a significant amount of space. Okay. I could see that from the tempo-based work that was early in the season that she was losing this attribute. So very quickly, the problem for us was that she wasn't displacing as she was at the end of last season. So we started to add in some speed strength work where she was doing some resisted sprinting, either on the 1080 or with a sled twice a week. She was doing some hill runs, right? And I changed her for the first time in her career, which is hard to believe at 29. She actually started lifting maximally, where she was doing reps between, sets with between 2 and 4 repetitions. She became significantly stronger across the maximal strength work, and the speed strength work complemented that, which bled into our speed-based work on the track, where the force application times are a lot shorter. Okay, so we're training the whole continuum here. And second race of the season, she drops this, this PR, and she's been in significant programs before. And that's not to be critical of them, but it's to be complementary to taking this problem-based approach and trying to have a thorough understanding of all of the exercises that are within our training battery and how and when to deploy them.
No, I agree. I think for me, if I had to choose one exercise and only one, I would answer stadium stairs. I think you can get so much plyometrics, explosiveness, bounding, single leg bounding, hops. Those are like one of my favorite. And I think on Mike's program, you can see them doing a lot of the stadium because you have access to a stadium. So that's my thing. But at the end of the day, I put in the chat that the two things for, at least for masters, is the neural effect of what you do, right? Sprinting, right? You're contracting, you're trying to go 5 strides per second, the frequency of 5 per second, and the rate of force development, the amount of force you can apply to the ground. I think once you get those two at a half decent shape, you're able to start adding more and more elements to your program. Mike, want to chime in a bit more on that, or?
I think a lot of people hop up the stairs.
Yeah.
I think hopping down the stairs is arguably more important because Charlie Francis said something along the lines of the ability to tolerate the shock of landing determines all that follows. And I agree with that. And you've got to be able to absorb and, eccentrically, and then convert concentrically as quickly as possible. That's certainly in the case in skips. So get off the floor as quickly as you can. Don't be afraid to use the entire foot, not just the ball of the foot. That's a big mistake that a lot of people make. You can, and I think Dan Paff was also identified that apart from Usain Bolt, who had some kind of possibly the architecture of his ankles were a little bit different, most sprinters will touch their heel on the track. And when I was a schoolboy, we were told never let that happen. Well, that was a mistake. Just because there's theory and then there's what's actually happening out there on the track. So the other thing I was going to mention is that Randy Huntington, who was the best known as the coach of Mike Powell, who still holds the world long jump record, he loves his Kaiser pneumatic weight training system or strength training system, power training really. And I love it too, but it's out of my price range. I can't afford it, but it's fabulous stuff. And he's coached that wonderful new Chinese guy who ran in the 9.8. Was it Su?
Su Bingtan.
Yeah, fantastic athlete. Wow, he's so fast. And a lot of that's, I guess, from you. Certainly, he uses the 1080 distance system, and a lot of Kaiser pneumatic squat machine, and presumably leg press as well. And you can use that stuff really, really explosively without getting hurt. Anyway, that's all I have to say on that topic.
No, it's good. Randy's a great coach. And I think, like Kevin said, we can talk forever on weight training and plyometrics.
Jimson, just to touch on what Mike said there, I think, when you're looking at plyometric activity, and what Mike was starting to refer to there is, the discussion about stiffness, okay, and amortization. And while that's important, I think fundamentally first, let's get the basic parameters correct. And so you want to ensure that the athlete is running biomechanically correctly. Amortization times are going to be, don't put the cart before the horse. Amortization times are going to be a lot higher if the athlete is not, if the motor skill is not in place. So if the athlete's foot is landing significantly in front of the center of mass, okay, the ground contact times inherently are going to be longer, so the amortization times are going to be longer. It doesn't matter how much stiffness or how much strength you develop in that athlete until you clean the technique up. At the point where you have the foot landing where you want it to land, okay, and you see that there is a high rate of amortization longer than you want it to be, then you start to consider some of the tools you have in your toolbox to clean that up over a long or medium term or period of time, okay? When it comes to plyometrics, fundamentally, can not emphasize this enough, please teach the athletes how to land the jump and amortize first, okay? If an athlete is stepping down off a step or a box and they're plantar flexing, they're just encouraging greater ground contact times and amortization and injury, okay? And so, if you look at the rudiment series that Coach Paff has discussed a lot, you Google that rudiment series, there's a whole series of low amplitude hops in there that are basically preparing the athlete for ground contact, okay? This is important in sprinting and plyometric activity. So we want to get the fundamentals of these things right. What are the qualities that are required to conduct this exercise properly? And we want to work those before we ascend the complexity of the exercise. Okay, so and like we said, we did say we could talk about this a lot, and I'm trying not to go too far here. When you're doing this kind of work, it is highly taxing on the nervous system. So you have to make a decision as to what the priority is in your training at that period. If it is high CNS speed work, then you have to be very discretionary with the explosive plyometric work, okay? Because these things are going to compete for the same resources, all right? Now, there may be a period of time where you've determined that doing plyometric work is important, but then you're going to have to modify your the speed components of your program accordingly to allow for that additional nervous system fatigue that's going to come through the plyometric work.
Yeah, good point. Mike, anything to add? I think we're almost at the end of 2 hours, and I haven't even gone through a third of the questions. I mean, we can really talk forever on this, but do you want to take questions, or?
Yeah, do you want to open it up to the audience, or?
Yeah, I can. There are a couple of questions that we didn't answer yet. I'll go through them as best I can. So the question was from Ian on the subject of recovery. What are some indicators you look out for recovery of CNS to determine the next session? Kind of what Kevin just mentioned. So Mike, want to answer that? What do you look for in terms of recovery? How do you know when they're trashed or not trashed or fresh?
Well, I try to avoid them being trashed. We try to, what Dan would say, the minimum effective dose of work. So we might only do 3 or 4 or 5 brief runs. Sometimes 1 or 2 is enough. Depends. It just always depends on the individual. And I'm not being very helpful here, but I just think that the reason that we go into low intensity the very next day and then follow that with a day off is to avoid that sort of crisis ever arising. But I think that I'm not an expert in that area, so I would defer to you two guys.
Well, I think, like for me, in the old days was take your morning pulse That was the old days. If you're overtraining, overreaching, believe it or not. But my first thing is, after practice, the first question I ask the athlete is, how do you feel? That's the very first question you ask. How do you feel? Or sorry, put the phone down. Then how do you feel? And then you can get an idea of how they are. That's the best indicator. Today, I mean, for another talk, we can talk about all these gadgets you have, like HRV, heart rate variability monitors. There are Fitbits for determining sleep, restful sleep. I mean, there's so much technology out there we can use. And with technology, the coach can actually have access to yourself. That's a bit creepy, but that's something else for another day. But there are technology to help you with that. But like I said, at the end of the day, only, coaching's an art and a science. And it's only through careful crafting and talking to your athlete, communicating with your athlete, you can actually see, if they're trashed or not the next day, or if they're ready to perform. I remember a quick story here. So when I was in Rome, Italy, I was based there for several years. And I remember the Rome Golden Gala was going on, and I went there to watch, and Dan Paff was there with 3 of his athletes. And I saw him on the track as they were warming up. And I was like, hey, Dan, how's it going? Long time no see. And I can see I was bothering him. You can see Dan was just not wanting to talk to me. And I realized that Dan was actually watching his athletes in a warm-up. He was actually watching and listening to running, listening to the pounding, and the warm-up. The coach's eye is probably the best source of information to see if the athletes are running. So, I just gracefully left the stadium and then caught up with Dan after. But yeah, that's my take. Kevin, you want to answer about how do you know when they're ready? How do you know when they're not ready?
Yeah, I think there's, like you said, there's all kinds of technologies that you can use that we're going to take a significant amount of time to understand their relativeness to the particular athlete that's in front of you. Okay. And if you have that time and you have that resource, and if you work for, a football program in the Premier League and you have multiple staff that can collect that data, then that's possibly something you can use. There are simple tools that you can use around the track, and starting, we started this conversation by talking about having a relationship with the athlete, having that conversation, right? And watching them carefully. This isn't a period of time where, we have to catch ourselves because, sometimes you're used to doing the same routine every day, and you're talking to fellow coaches, but you're paying attention to the athletes as they arrive, as they get to the track. How is their energy level today compared to how it was 2 days ago? How are they interacting with the other athletes? How quickly are they getting up and moving and completing the warm-up? What does their movement skill and their coordination look like in the warm-up? Is there any differences? Do you see, as you start to understand biomechanics better, are you starting to see asymmetries that are developing, like things that are happening on one side that aren't happening on the other side that weren't present before? Okay. And they may tell you one thing, also understanding what their psyche is like, because some athletes want to complete the workout that's on the paper, and whether you actually give them a program in advance is a whole nother question. But so, that they're competitive and they want to be doing that work. Another thing that we've used successfully, that we've deployed successfully here, is just a simple questionnaire. And you basically ask the athletes to rate, these 3 questions every day on a 1 to 10 scale around how they slept the night before, what their perceived effort was on the workout the day before, and what they believe their current readiness score is for today's training. And then you add those 3 scores up and you divide by 3 and you'll have a number. Now that number in and of itself doesn't mean anything, but over a period of time, you'll be able to compare that number to their previous scores. And that historical data will give you another indicator as to where they're at. I think it's important. I understand that everyone has a different context and everyone is in a different environment. The context that we're in right now, we are able to train every day if we have to. So if something's not right, we go to plan B immediately, okay? And we push the high intensive session to the next day. And if we can't get it done the next day for some reason, we push it to the day after that. There was some research that actually came out on the Australian national team program in the last decade, that basically said that, your chances of achieving your performance goal diminish significantly if you're not able to complete over 80% of your quality sessions over the course of the year. So injury prevention has to be crucial with any athlete in high performance, right? And so, as Mike said, quality is an important driver for us, but that doesn't mean that you're not doing volume at different times of the year. At times we're definitely doing voluminous work, and we're expecting them to come in tired, and we're going to expect them to train. we're just not going to expose them to high risk activity that could be injurious.
Yeah, agree on
Oh,
that.
I'll just, add to that. I always wait to see how they survive the warm-up. Just do your normal warm-up, whatever you feel that you need to do. And then let's have a chat. Let's have a talk and see, what do you feel like doing today? What do you feel you're capable of doing? This is what I would like to do today. But, all right, so you can't do that. Well, let's just do a tempo session. Let's do a junk session. Let's just keep the motor rolling, keep the wheels turning, and let's revisit this tomorrow or the next day or in 2 days' time. Let's see. But always wait for the warm-up, and that will determine what we do.
Exactly, kind of like what Dan told me back then. We're on the 2-hour mark. Kevin, there was one question here from Peter or Piotr. You want to answer that or save it for another time?
What was the question? Piotr's a smart guy, so I'm not sure to answer his question.
How did the transition from your legendary indoor stacked 40s towards the longer distances based SE1 SE2 work look like when the spring arrives?
Yeah, I think so. He's talking about, when we ran this program with Richard Buck in England, I've done it with Paul Dediwo here, but with Shane Nemi, Tyler Christopher in Canada. The Tyler situation simply was this. He started with me at 20, and he'd had 3 hamstring injuries the year before. Despite those injuries, every time he stepped on the track, he ran 45.6, 45.7. He actually won the 2004 Olympic trials on a pulled hamstring. That was before I was coaching him. I was in Nike. He came up to me before the event. He said, I hear you're moving to Edmonton. He goes, what do you think I need to do to win this race? And actually his competition was Shane, who I'd coached the previous 4 years. And I wasn't coaching that year. And I just said to him, I said, well, you're going to be in the most jeopardy for pulling the hamstring, in the early phases of the race. So you're just going to have to pace it. And he ran the race perfectly. He was 10 meters behind coming off the corner, and he ran it down, ran 45.6. So it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that this kid was talented. So I went into the first season basically on the premise that, I could see that there were errors in his acceleration technique, which are obviously going to affect max velocity technique. And that was the main factor driving the hamstring injury. And so I assumed that if I could just, based on what I was talking about earlier, the number of training days in the year that you're able to successfully complete, if I could increase the number of training days that he completed, however low the volume was, he would be in a better position. And I felt like, okay, he should be able to break 45 seconds if he just stays healthy. So we cleaned up his acceleration, and we spent a lot of time. I know that I went back to my records. He did 1,030 meter accelerations that year. Now, part of that was the environment we in. There was a lot of snow, right? We were on an indoor track for 6 months out of the year. Okay. And I would simply just go from when I felt like the biomechanical properties were in place to take them beyond the acceleration phase into 30 meters, 40 meters, 50 meters, we would progress into those areas. So when we transitioned outdoors that season, he actually hadn't done a lot of speed endurance or specific endurance volumes. And I remember we were about to go to competition. And I said, okay, I have no clue where you're at because you haven't run indoors. I put him on the track by himself, and he ran 45 flat. And it was kind of like, okay, we're in a good place. He went to Brazil and he opened up in 44.88, missed the Canadian record by 200s, went 44.72 the week after, won the Paris Golden League in 44.62, which was another Canadian record. And then went 44.4 at the World Championships that year. That was on an extremely low volume program. Now, there may have been some carryover from the previous program, but it's hard to tell because he missed so many training days that, I'm not sure that there was any kind of, saturation around any type of ability that was occurring. I mean, he was just exceptionally gifted and had really high elastic qualities. What I found with him was that he was really good with, in the area of speed endurance and limited specific endurance. We didn't do a lot of intensive tempo because he was, the way he produced, he tended to cramp constantly anytime I put under a significant amount of fatigue. He had a significant number of issues that were never going to be resolved in terms of how he amortized, how his feet moved, how, you know, how he struck the ground. And so, you know, the properties that actually made him a high performer were actually a detriment in certain areas. Like if, you know, I wanted him to be the king of intensive tempo, that was never going to happen. But that wasn't something that he needed, because like I said, he ran 45 flat hand basically off of acceleration work. You could argue I probably didn't do a good enough job with him, because possibly he should have run 43 seconds. You know, I mean, that's how talented he was.
Yeah, every once in a while you get these athletes that come under your belt, under your wing, and it's a blessing, but it can be a curse as well. You just got to get it right. And at the end of the day, you can do what you can do, but at the end, it's them running, them executing, right? You can't help anything other than being the sidelines. But
yeah, I mean, I had, like I said, I've been in this a long time. And a couple of years ago, I had Paul Dedewo, Fred Curley, and Dontavius Wright training together. Dontavius had run 45-50 indoors. They lined up to run a 300. And I rarely let them run together for a variety of reasons, and primarily injury prevention, especially when it's full out. But they convinced me to let them run this 300 together. And they ran 30.8, 31.1, and 31.8. Dante ran the 31.8 and got smoked. And he actually did win the US championships in an off season where it was indoor, where he ran over 300 meters. He actually was the US national champion when he over 300 meters. And he was getting destroyed by these two guys that were running, you know, these, I mean, I just sat back and it's almost like, I don't think I saw anything in that run, except you're just sitting there looking like, what have I come into here? I mean, this is a, you know, this is a blessing here in terms of like genetic ability.
And before we run out of time, can I just go back and have another quick look at the race construction of these fast 400s? We talk about speed and speed endurance and speed reserve. The first 100 of all the, you know, the top, say, half a dozen fastest 400s in history, men, is between 10.8 and 11.3 in Butch Reynolds' case, but mostly around 10.8 to 11 flat for the first 100. That's not spectacular. But what we're looking at is the middle 200. I mean, the last 100 is not spectacular either. In most cases, like what did in Van Niekerk's world record was basically 12 seconds, 11.97 for the last 100. So the work is being done, really, the big work is being done in the middle part, down the back straight and through the top turn. And these are the 200 meter, the flying 200 times are really quite interesting to me. Van Niekerk, middle 200, 20.29. Michael Johnson in his world record, in his fastest world record, 20.56. Butch Reynolds, 20.8. Wade Van Niekerk, another earlier run, 20.5. Jeremy Warriner, 20.8. Michael Norman, 21.1. Quincy Watts, 20.6. Looking at the structure of the race in, yeah, that's all there. The structure of the race in Rio, the world record run, LaShawn Merritt ran the back straight in 9.6 seconds, and he ran 20.4 for the first 200 in Rio. That's the halfway mark, 20.4, which is clearly a bit too fast for him. So I just felt that was worth having a look at for coaches that want to really break down their 400s for their athlete. If you possibly can stand in the middle of the field and just, yeah, if for that, most people don't have a biomechanist that's going to mark out the track for them. We put big cone, big fluoro cone at the 100, 200, 300 marks, and videoed it all and took the times, or tried to also clock the times, or had somebody standing in line with the lane stagger, one person in every area at the 1, 2, and 3 mark, and the 400 mark would be official. And you get your breakdowns, and I think you can play with that and see where your weaknesses are. And for example, one of my athletes ran 11.2 for the first 100, and I said, that's quite good. And 11.2 for the third 100. Why can't we progress this event? Because the back straight was 11 flat. And normally in these high performance races where you're talking about someone trying to get onto a national team, get onto the international track, you're running pretty close to a second faster on the back straight than you are for the opening 100. That might be, it depends on how you structure it, but it might be 0.6 or 0.8 faster or a whole second, but not 0.2. And so we rectified that, realising we knew that there was a problem on the back straight, but that was important for the athlete to see the time and understand and comprehend and have a look at these splits that you just held up and see what the rest of the world's doing. And then this person, who I love dearly, changed immediately and ran a PB the very next race, because he came to grips with the idea that, you're just being too conservative down the back straight, and it's not really helping. We've got to get to the 300 a lot quicker.
Yeah. I think we can have another call and talk about race modeling, race differentials, talk about the statistics I put up on the board. There's just so much more to discuss, but I think we should close it up because we're like,
let's just, Jimson, real quickly. The thing that I find really interesting about those splits is, and you're right, this is a huge area again. It's interesting when you look at Michael Johnson's splits, and I think that there's an instructive lesson here for everyone that's looking at this data. And if you're listening to the narrative that comes out of the program, right? The Baylor program discusses a lot about how strength leads to speed and how endurance is important, right? And, in his book, and I think Clyde has talked about this before, Coach Hart, they talked about, sorry, not Jeremy, but Michael's propensity towards injury and why they had to move away from a speed-based approach. But it would be a mistake to think that Michael is running as fast as he's running in the third 100 meters because of that endurance-based work. I think the factor that's really driving that is the speed reserve. And although these were achieved in different years, Michael had a personal best of 19.3 in the 200 meters. And Coach Hart was very disciplined around pacing strategies to 200 and 300 meters. And so they constantly talked about running anywhere from 21.1 to 21.3. Well, if you've run 19.3 electric and you're going through in 21.2 hand, that's over a 2-second differential. It's going to be very easy to maintain that velocity through the third phase of the race. Okay. And so it always helps to approach all of these issues as a detective or as a puzzle solver. This is the interesting, exciting thing about coaching, right? Every athlete in front of you is a unique puzzle. You're a detective and you're trying to figure out what are the resources that I have for this specific athlete. And so don't always take things at surface level and surface explanations. Dig a little deeper and try and understand what's potentially driving this. And, like I said, speed reserve is an important component to this event, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that we're not doing enduring type work. It's just how much, when, and where.
Not true. And yeah, Mike, anything?
No, I mean, if people can get hold of that chart that I think Pierre-Jean Vazel prepared for the world, and just start breaking the numbers down and analysing segmentals. And look, that's not the way we run the race, but it just tells you something. It tells you something, and it gives you an idea of let's build down the back straight. Let's not put the handbrake on down the back straight and surge through that third 100. Hold your velocity, carry your momentum, carry it out of the third 100 and as far down the home straight as you can go. And we're talking technique and everything else involved there, the use of arms, when to use them, when to really turn the jets on, how long do you dare wait, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot. You can play around with the performance a lot if you've got the data. I think it helps anyway.
No, definitely. And I think there's many ways to roam, many ways to run the 400, many ways to coach the 400. And I really think hopefully, people who join this call gets a sense of appreciation of what what you can do, what's possible. You know, don't be afraid to experiment. Don't take our word as the gospel or God. You know, it worked for our athletes, ourselves, but it might be different for your athletes, your methods, your circumstances. And I really think that the purpose of why we got together and talked about this was because, you know, we want to just, you know, promote the sport and just promote coaching. And hopefully, you know, if you have anything new to share, please share it. And, you know, and I think, guys, we need to call again, and maybe not tomorrow, but maybe like a month's time or a few weeks time, and get some input from people. What do you think, Kevin, Mike?
I'd love it.
Yeah, I think that would be good. Also, just as a note, I mean, everyone's aware of the digital assets and courses that we have available. Yeah. I'm largely as the president of the company, I'm largely responsible for the operational aspects and a lot of the business side of it. But we are in the process of developing a 400-meter course, which is kind of like the last specific event that we need to publish. And our target is to have that out by the middle of April. So I'm happy to come on back around that time and maybe have additional conversations and even discuss, you know, what we've put in the course, and then simultaneously offer anyone who gets on the call a discount on that product.
I'd like to thank Kevin for getting up at 4 a.m. US time. Commitment far beyond the call of duty. So thanks, mate. Really great.
You're welcome. Happy to do it.
Thanks, Kevin. Although it is 6:20 now, so your day is ready to begin.
Yeah, I know. It's, exactly.
Okay, I think we should close it up. Mike, Kevin, thank you for taking the time, 2.5 hours worth. Again, please check out ALTIS. If you need any information, altis.world is your source. If you're interested in relays, by the way, guys, there's a great relay course by Vince Anderson. Vince, I think he's known for his famous wickets and his wicket charts, but I've seen him a couple of times on some Zoom calls, and he talks about his wickets, but his relay talk is really fascinating. There's a call with Ryan Banta where he starts talking about the relays, but if you really want an in-depth relay, both 4x1 and 4x4, highly recommend checking out his course. He's a great presenter, crystal clear, and it makes you really think on how you want to coach your 4x1 relays. Really, really recommended if anyone on the call here.
Yeah, I can only reiterate that. I was fortunate to see Vince speak in London in either 2011 or 2012, and I was blown away by his relay presentation. Yeah. I'd never seen anyone discuss the relay like that before. And it's very much for him an attitudinal event where you're trying to maintain stick velocity. And he talks about aggression and the passion that he uses in it. He would be a phenomenal national team relay coach. And we've got some great relay coaches here in America. We're blessed with that, obviously. But if you want to try and understand why the U.S. has had some success, historically, a lot of success in the event, I think the attitude of American athletes and coaches is a big driver of that. And I think it comes across strongly in that course.
Yeah, no, definitely.
I'd like to say, obviously, ALTIS is a huge resource for almost every event in the sport, but particularly the sprints and hurdles. And if you want to stay in touch with coaching across the sport as well, Jimson's speedendurance.com is a massive resource. So much information chronologued there. And if you just want to talk sprints pretty much and pick up a little bit of news and a bit of entertainment, join my little party at Fast Track 400 on Facebook, and you're very welcome. Just search it out, Fast Track 400, and I'll as administrator, I'll approve you.
Exactly. So we're all on Twitter. We're on Facebook. We have emails. You have my website. You have Facebook page. Kevin's website. Just reach out if you have any questions. We can't always answer right away, but we do our best to get back to everybody. No such thing as a dumb question. And yeah, we really like to promote coaching and your athletes, and it's all we want to see at the end of the day. Okay, guys, let's wrap it up. Thank you, everyone who joined. Well over 240 at one point. I think almost 1,000 subscribed to the session, and maybe next time we'll do it more Americans friendly. But for now, this was a great initiative. Once again, guys, thank you. Hope we meet in person. I'll be in Belgrade, Serbia, in 4 weeks' time. Anybody who wants to catch up with me there, hook me up, and I'll go for a drink or a meal with you. But yeah, definitely. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
All right, thanks for hosting, Jimson. Appreciate it.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, Mike, talk to you online.